Have all kinds of dads here, by the way. We've got dads that are in the traditional sense. We've got puppy dads and kitty dads, and we've got all kinds of dads. I've already been told, I'm a dad. If you're a guest, welcome to the Turlock Church of Christ. My name's John. I'm the minister here. I'm usually up behind that lectern up there, but today's different. And I wanted to explain that to you why. On Mother's Day, I kind of gave a testimonial about the relationship with my mother, which I grew up in an alcoholic home, and my mother and I had a very, very hard, difficult relationship. And I shared with her, with the congregation here, how much struggles I had with her. But eventually, I became a Christian. I gave up my sinful, addictive, and rock and roll ways, I guess you should say. And I became a Christian, and I moved back home after the military and moved in with my mom, and I shared how hard that was. But eventually, my mother attended church again for the first time in decades, and she eventually gave her life back to God about a year before she died. And family, I've been preaching here for 8 years. I have never received as many texts and emails and comments about a sermon than I did on Mother's Day. And it really wasn't a sermon. It was a testimonial. And I also want to explain to you, family, that I've been putting off that for about 25 years. Every Mother's Day would come around, I'm going, okay, I'm going to do it this year. And then I would chicken out and I wouldn't do it. But last month, everything inside of me, and I think God prompted me to do it, and it was very difficult, but I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I did it for you because I've heard so many things from you about that particular day, which leads me to my dad. And if you thought I was nervous last month about my mom, it's really nothing compared about how I feel right now about opening up my life to you and YouTube about my father and I. My dad was born in 1924, John Shaw McCraney III. And hit the next one. At 19 years old, he grew up in a religious home, a devout, church-going Protestant family, and in Arkansas, Jonesboro, Arkansas. But he couldn't wait to get out of that. He couldn't wait to leave all that, and he did. He joined the Navy and never looked back, never went to church, never did anything about that at all. He went into the Navy as a young man, doing what a lot of guys back in those days did in the Navy as young men. And my dad was a hard-drinking, hard-working, hard-playing man. And he decided he was never going to get married. He was a lifer. He was going to be a lifer and never settle down. Well, he met my mom. My mom was 10 years older than my dad, but he met her in a bar. They fell in love and they got married. And so marrying an older woman, my dad never expected he was going to have a child. I mean, she was already 41 or 40, I think, when they married. But at just under shy of 42 years old, ta-da! Back then, I don't know, some of you guys have been around a while, the rabbit done died, okay? And so I was born 6 weeks premature in a naval hospital, and they put me in an incubator, and the doctor said to my dad, he may not make it. He's too small, and he's just got too many things going against him. Oh, by the way, my mom smoked and drank the entire time she was pregnant. So my dad said a prayer that day in front of that incubator. And he said, God, if you let my son live, I'll go back to church and I'll get my life right. Well, obviously I made it. I'm still making it. So my mom and my dad and this little itty bitty dinky tiny baby I couldn't even sit up until I was 14 months old. I couldn't sit up on my own. I'd fall over. I was just so small and weak. And so anyway, my mom and my dad and me in a little stroller and all that, and went to a little tiny Church of Christ in Hutchinson, Kansas, and started a new life. Next one. So this is probably representative of the happiest days in the McCraney family. My mom is really happy. My dad's and my mom both sobered up, stopped drinking. They got the baby. Everybody's shocked that John is a dad. And they're more shocked that both of them aren't drinking. So, on both sides of the family. Everybody's looking at it like, wow. And it was really good days, really, really good days. Going to church and all that. Not exceptionally long after this, while I was still very small and in diapers, my dad got orders for the Philippines, his whole unit. He was an aircraft mechanic in the Navy, and so his squadron got assigned to the Philippines, and off he went, and my mom and I joined him later. And I think I shared with you that my mom hated the Philippines. She did not want to be over the Philippines at all. And she just didn't want it. She wanted to be back home. She wanted to be back in the United States. She wanted to be back in Arkansas, and it just wasn't happening. And my mom got in a really bad mood. And you know what happens to women who sober up and get in a bad mood? Started drinking again. And so it got really bad, and then my dad started drinking, and then they started getting into that whole thing, and it got really, really, really bad, especially when my dad came home from work one day, working in the hangar, and when we lived in a Quonset hut, and he walked in there, and my mom was passed out on the couch, and I was playing with an empty vodka bottle on the concrete floor, crawling around and knocking it across the floor and going and getting it, and my dad was furious. And so you can imagine what a strong man with a bad temper can do to a woman that he is upset with. It deteriorated pretty quickly. He ended up getting stationed in Lemoore, down here south of us, and so it was there where their relationship got so bad that my mom hated my father, and I think he hated her too, and they were physical and abusive and screaming at each other, and I don't know, I don't remember any of this. I was 4 when we left there. I don't remember anything really before. I think I was 5 or 6, but anyway, my mom left him and moved to Sacramento, where my half-sister and her 3 kids lived, and so we went up there, and so I grew up with my mom. My dad had no idea where we were, none whatsoever. He came home from work, the house was empty except for 2 sea bags in his chest that he had his personal stuff in, his guns and his coins and whatever. That's what he had no idea where we were at all. So I didn't see my dad growing up, and as I got older, every time my mom would bring up my dad, it was always the same picture. He was a terrible, ogre, awful, abusive, drunkard, and mean, and da-da-da. And so, of course, as a child, you know, the picture I had of him was terrible. So he retired from the Navy, and he found out that we were in Sacramento. He found out where we were because my mom was still on benefits. They never divorced. So he found out where she lived, and he came, and he told me later on he was intending to just take me back to Arkansas. He was going to grab me and go. And my mom knew that, so she wouldn't let him go. And so anyway, I just remember when he showed up, I looked at him and I was terrified. I mean, I was terrified of him because of everything that my mom had ever said. And so he disappeared. I didn't see him after that until I joined the United States Coast Guard, and I ended up going into aviation mechanics school in Millington, Tennessee, which is a state away from Arkansas, where my dad retired and settled. my dad was on a flight cruise all the time, and one of the guys who was a pilot on my dad's P9, I think they call it, became the commander of this training school in Millington, Tennessee. He called my dad up. He goes, Mac, there's a student on the roster here, John Shaw McCraney IV. And my dad goes, oh, that's got to be my son. Where's he from? And he goes, well, it looks like he's from Sacramento. And he goes, yeah, that's my boy. And so he mentioned it to his sister. And she said, well, you gotta see him. And my dad goes, no, I don't gotta. And she goes, yes, you do. So anyway, her husband was a retired warrant officer, and so she pulled some strings, and I got called to the main office of the base, which was never good in my day of drinking and wildness. And I thought, oh no, I've been busted, and I'm about ready to go to the brig, they called it. Seriously. I walk in there, and this woman comes up and goes, are you John? And I said, yeah. And she goes, oh, I'm your aunt. And she hugged on me, and then, there's this guy with her, and I'm like, well, I'm your Uncle Lloyd, and how are you? And and she goes, I'm your daddy's sister, baby sister, and John, go get your things packed. We got you a 4-day pass. We're taking you to Little Rock. I didn't know any McCraneys. I knew nothing about my side of the family. I was, So sure enough, we end up in the car, and we're driving to Little Rock from Tennessee, and all the way, my aunt was chatty. Woo! Oh, my word. And Uncle Lloyd didn't say squat, nothing. Later on, I figured out why. But so anyway, she goes, I told your dad that we're going to come and get you, and he's going to meet us at the house when we get back. And I knew that going in, and I was nervous, and part of me was like, you know what? I'm finally gonna meet my dad, really. I mean, growing up, I was the only kid in my crew that didn't have a father. All my other friends had dads. They had to be home by dinner. I didn't. They got in trouble. They got spanked. When they did it, I didn't get spanked. I didn't have a dad to, anyway, so I get to my aunt's house, all my uncles and cousins and all these McCraneys are going, so you're the one that lives in California. By the way, I took after my mother's English side, because all those are Scots. They're like 5'5", stout Scots. And I was like this taller than everybody in the room. It was really weird. Like, are you really? We're related? So this truck pulls up in front of the house, and my heart's racing in my chest, and I knew it was him, and so I walked out of the house and walked down the sidewalk. He got out of his truck and walked up to the sidewalk, and it got about as far as Hoy is from here to there. He looked at me, and he said, this is the first thing he said to me, oh my God, you look like a bartender your mother and I used to know. Now, once you get past the laughter that you just shared, I felt like he took a .357 Magnum and placed it against my chest and pulled the trigger. But before I even took 3 steps closer to him, I'm going, is this even my dad? Was my mom whoring around on my dad? I'm not his? Why am I here? I don't look like him, and I don't look like anybody else in this whole house. Are you really I'm thinking, what are you saying? What kind of person would look at a son and make the first comment like that? What kind of person does that? Now, that stuff happened to me in 3 seconds inside my head before I took a step closer to him. That was our reunion. He says, get your junk, put it in the truck, I'm taking it to my place. Okay. And I did. And we went to his little 32-foot travel trailer in a trailer park. And we drank all weekend. I wasn't a Christian yet. I was still, obviously. And all we did was brag about stuff that nobody ever believed. That's all we did. So when my aunt took me back to base and dropped me off, honestly, I was thinking, maybe it was good I didn't grow up with that guy in my life. So just before I got out of the Coast Guard in North Carolina, I was baptized into Christ. 6 weeks before I got out of the service. And so I had that 3,000-mile drive from North Carolina to Sacramento to drive, and I stopped by Arkansas to see my dad, see my aunt. I drove, and I got to his place, and after dinner, I said, I need you to know something, Dad. I got baptized into Christ. I'm a Christian now. And he goes, oh, yeah, there's all kinds of people saying they're Christian now, isn't there? You see, my dad went to a church where the pastor was a powerful figure within the town and exceptionally powerful within his church. But my dad found out as a teenager that he was also the one who was running moonshine on the side. And that the pastor's sons were the drivers of the moonshine. And they all sat in church and looked proper and talked about God. And my dad couldn't take it. It was too much hypocrisy. And he left the church long before his body left the building, if you know what I mean. And so that conversation didn't go well because I wanted to talk to my dad about his relationship with God. I wanted to talk to him about that. He didn't want to talk about that. Made that very clear. So when I left there and I got home, moved in with my mom, you've heard that story. My dad and I didn't really have much to talk about, but he did, we communicated by mail once in a while, by phone. But it was all just not very engaged. I didn't want to engage. I didn't want to engage with him, so I didn't. But then I met Becky, and then I married Becca, and then after we got married, I went to Dallas to go to school, and that's only a few hours away from Arkansas. And when my dad met Becca, he fell in love. He loved her. Oh my word. It was all about Becca, which was great. I was like, that's fantastic. At least somebody in the house is getting some, right? It was great. And he would spoil her and buy her stuff. And later on, after we ended up in the ministry and we were in Fresno, he was starting to send her bribes to get pregnant. He would send her like a piece of jewelry and say, bribe number 1. And then send her something else, Black Hills Gold. He loved Black Hills Gold. And in fact, this ring was his. He gave it to me. And he loved Black Hills Gold, and he would send her a necklace or something like that with Black Hills Gold, and he said he would ask, anything in the oven yet? That's all it said. And so when Becky became pregnant and gave birth to our oldest, he was elated. He sent gifts from there, and since I'm John Shaw McCraney, my son is the 5th, but if you look at his birth certificate, it says John Shaw McCraney V. And so my dad would write him and send him stuff like a baseball mitt when he was like 4 years old or 4 days old or whatever. But, it was like from 3 to V. That was the deal. And he would send him cassette tapes and talk to him and send those tapes in the mail. And then we had Matthew, and my dad came out to Sacramento and got to spend some time. Next slide, brother. So this happy days going on. My dad and I relationship still strained, but he loved my family, and I wanted my boys to know their grandfather because I never knew my grandfathers at all. And so, as in time, something very big happened, and that was I decided to go to preaching school, and then I decided to be a preacher after I went to school. The moment that I told my father that I was going to go into the ministry was the moment that our relationship just went like that, because he hated preachers, hated him. And his son was becoming one, and he hated it. I remember I called him on the phone. I said I was in Dallas and I was going to school, and I told him I'm not going to school to be a preacher. I just want to learn the Bible, and I think he admired that. But then I told him, I said, I think God's calling me to be a preacher, and I'm going to start looking for a church. And he says, well, I guess I'll just tell my friends you're a barber. Click. That was it. So our relationship wasn't good because I was a preacher, and he would send me books in the mail. God's bully pulpits with all these big televangelists that fallen from grace. He would send me articles from the newspaper about another pastor who just got caught and sent to jail for fraud. Every time there was some preacher that did something stupid, I ended up with a clipping in the mail. And no note, no nothing, just that's what you are. Thank you very much. Anyway, my dad drank really heavy and lived a crazy life, but at 74, all that caught up with him, and he began to have serious health issues, and he ended up in the VA hospital in Little Rock, and he called me, and he said, I need you to come see me. They're telling me I'm dying. And I said, okay. I actually have a seminar not too far from there I'll fly out after the seminar. And he said, don't take a ticket back. I've got a truck I want you to drive home. And I said, okay, thank you. So I did. I got there, and he was in the hospital, and I so wish that I could share with you that we had a great conversation while he was there in that hospital bed. I so wish that I could. I so wanted to talk to him about getting his house in order. That was what I really prayed about and wanted to talk to him about. And were you guys here on Mother's Day? Remember how God had moved in my mom's life and she gave her life to the Lord before she died? I wanted that to happen for my dad. And the moment I started bringing that up, he shut that down right then. And then he started talking about all these stupid stories of what he did when he was in Italy and how he used to do this and it was all sin, and it was all immoral and debauchery and all that stuff. And I'm sitting there in this hospital, and he's telling me all these stories, knowing that his son's a preacher, and he's telling stories a preacher doesn't ever want to hear anybody talk about, much less their own dad. I mean, why would you tell your preacher son, oh, and we hired some really great hookers when we were in Spain? And I looked at him, and I thought I'm like, this is a joke. He's working this around to something. Well, he wasn't. And when I realized that, I said, did you want to talk about this? Is this the reason why you had me come out here? Was to talk about this? And he goes, oh, that's nothing. And he just kept going. And I just basically sat there, and I kept remembering, honor your father and your mother, honor your father and your mother, honor your father and your mother. You honored your mother, honor your father. And I'm sitting there, and everything in me wants to go. And so when he got done, I was there for hours and hours. And I said, it's late, and I've been on the road all day. And I said, Pop, I'm not gonna be back here tomorrow. I'm going home. Well, why are you leaving so soon? Well, I thought you and I were out to talk about something important, something meaningful. But that's not what this conversation's about. Well, I said, I'm leaving in the morning. And his truck was parked at my aunt's house, and I got the keys, I got in that truck, and I drove home from Little Rock to Santa Paula, California. And it was a miserable drive, and I was really upset. And he died in the hospital. my aunt, who was a church-going woman, called me, and she said, Johnny, I just got the most amazing, beautiful news. God is working, God is working, God is working. Your dad's okay. And I go, how do you know my dad's okay? Because I just found out that he wanted to talk to the chaplain at the hospital shortly before he died. And I'm just sure that he got his life right with God. And I go, oh, I hope so. I really do, Aunt Catherine. I really hope so. And so I called the hospital, and I called the chaplain's office. And I said, this is John McCraney, minister of the Church of Christ. He says, can you get me in touch with the chaplain who saw John McCraney? And he goes, it was me. And he gave me his name. I can't remember what it was. And he said, and I also preach for the Church of Christ. And I said, well, brother, I'm preaching in the Santa Paula Church of Christ right now. And he goes, oh, yeah. Your dad mentioned that you were a Church of Christ preacher. And as I waited, he said, brother, I'm so sorry. The last thing that I talked about with your dad was telling him, don't worry about where your money's going to go. Mac, get your life right with God. And all he wanted to talk about was his money. And he says, I am so sorry to tell you that. And when I hung up the phone, I bawled my eyeballs out and I cried. Wasn't very long after that, I got a box in the mail. And by the way, my dad didn't tell me this, but he wanted me to scatter his ashes out at sea. So I got this box of ashes from a mortuary with instructions to take it out to the Pacific Ocean and scatter them on the water. Well, he was a Navy guy. Makes sense, right? And so I got a hold of a brother in Oxnard who had a cabin cruiser, and me and Becky and the boys and some close friends of ours in the church went out. Remember how terrible that was, Becky? Man, wind was blowing and choppy waves, and I was so seasick. I swore when I got off that Coast Guard cutter I'd never go out there again. And man, I got so sick to my stomach, and it was terrible. It was terrible. And but I thought once I had scattered his ashes and we got back, and it would be like that's over. Now that's over. That's all over now. He's gone, and it's over. And now we move on. And I wish that was true, but I want to tell you it wasn't true. And I want to tell you that in my mind, I was sure that I had forgiven my father because I knew I was commanded by God to forgive my father. And I knew that God, my father, was telling me to forgive my dad. And I knew that. And in my mind, I was sure that I had followed that commandment, that I had done that I had said, I forgive my dad. But in time, it was obvious that I had not forgiven him in my heart. And I got very depressed, and I got very troubled, and I got very grumpy, and I was hard to live with. And it was about that. And it took a lot of help, professional help, for me to finally release my resentment against my dad. I truly believe that if you do what your Heavenly Father says, He'll reward you every time. I truly believe that the God the Father does not hold back rewards for His faithful children. I also want to share with you one day when I was reading the book of Psalms. In Psalm 68, it says, sing to God, sing praises to His name, lift up a song to Him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord, exult before Him. Psalm 68:5, a father to the fatherless and a protector of widows is God in His holy habitation. And when I read that, I leapt with joy because I realized I have a dad. I have a dad. I didn't grow up with a dad. The dad that I ended up meeting with as an adult was terrible. But I have a dad, And he can be with me anywhere, and he's a pretty good dad, by the way. I even began to pray, Abba, Father. And it took such great comfort. And people start talking about their dads, I go, oh, my dad's better than your dad. Oh, yeah, everybody says that. No, really, he is. It was later on that became so real to me, so reinforced, that God, my heavenly Father, my Abba, my Papa, was with me all the time, and no matter where I was, he would be with me, and I could walk with him, and I could talk to him, because he was my dad. And it was later on, I was preaching a series of sermons, and I came across 2 Corinthians 6, and in the latter part of verse 16, there's a quote from the Old Testament passages, and it says, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. And boy, isn't that a beautiful affirmation? You leave the world and all that sin, and you come to me, and I'll be your father, and you'll be my son, you'll be my daughter. And that's exactly true for me right now. But every time that I have followed God's commandments, even when I haven't wanted to, I still did it because he's the Lord and I'm not. And every time I follow the commandments of God, especially in these really hard situations like relationships, and especially with my dad, he has never failed to reward me for those steps of sacrifice and faith. And while I have never had a biological father that I have lived with and or wanted to, God has given me some beautiful fathers in the church. I've had some great dads all through time. There's always been that older gentleman in the church that just, for whatever reason, loves me and has supported me, and we've had great times and good things, and I've been able to talk to, and I've been able to say, I don't know what I'm doing about how to raise kids because I wasn't around kids, and I don't know how to do this and that, and okay, those dad talks, and I've had, these different churches we've served, I've had these different brothers who and they're almost all gone. I've buried pretty much all of them, and I texted one this morning, and I said, Happy Father's Figure Day. And John texted back and he said, Thank you, son. I love you. Well, I'm afraid that I've just put a big downer on Father's Day is what I'm thinking I did. Not everything ends up great, and not everybody decides to do the right thing, no matter how much they've been loved or talked to. And I know the stories of a lot of you here in this room. You have your own parallel experiences of people in your family that reject God on his terms. And there's a pain that comes with that doesn't go away. But it can be eased by God replacing that person with another. Some of us didn't have great moms, but we have great moms in the church. And some of us didn't have great siblings in our household, but we have great siblings here. And some of us have, some of us have never even had children, and we have kids now here. And, that's family, amen. Blood is thicker than water, is it not? Well, spirit's thicker than blood, friend. And I'm telling you, whatever you don't have and wish you'd had, God can make up for that. And there are people that are more than willing to be a brother and a sister and a dad and a mom and even a daughter or a son. Believe me, that's true. So happy Father's Day, dads. And Mark, thank you for saying in that prayer what was the best. Happy Father's Day, Dad. Thank you. Joe, let's stand up and let's sing. If you got something on your heart that you want to share it with us, let us know.